British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has urged Russia against a military adventure near the Ukrainian-Polish border. According to him, this would be a tragic mistake. Several English-language media report unanimously on this. Amid growing concerns in the West and in the US about Russian military movements on the Ukrainian border, Johnson adopted a serious tone in a meeting with the Parliamentary Oversight Committee. Everyone understands that the cost of miscalculations at the borders with both Poland and Ukraine will be enormous, said Johnson before a panel, and adding, "I think it would be a tragic mistake for the Kremlin to believe that profits can be made from a military adventure." The defense ministers of Great Britain and Ukraine had previously agreed in a joint declaration that, although they did not want to be hostile to Russia, they were concerned about its military activities on the border with Ukraine. The paper Mirror reported last week, citing sources familiar with the situation, that Great Britain had agreed to transfer up to 600 soldiers from a special unit to Ukraine for fear of an allegedly imminent Russian invasion. According to a senior British military officer quoted by the paper, the risk of an accidental outbreak of war between the West and Russia is currently greater than at any time since the Cold War. The Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, Andriy Melnik, also expressed concern this week about the influx of migrants and the unusual activities of the Russian army in the border area with Ukraine. Accordingly, he fears that smuggled migrants could be diverted from the Belarusian-Polish border to the border with Ukraine. He also did not rule out Russian intervention in Ukraine. According to him, the current migrant crisis is being orchestrated by the Belarusian ruler Alexander Lukashenko and Kremlin chief Vladimir Putin in order to conceal Russia's military activities off the eastern border of Ukraine and in Donbas. The Russian Foreign Ministry rejected reports from several Western media outlets alleging that Russia had troops stationed on the border with Ukraine. The press secretary of the Russian president, Dmitry Peskov, said that Russia is moving troops within its territory and at its own discretion. Russia had repeatedly denied allegations of aggressive action by the West and Ukraine and has declared that it will not threaten anyone. It was also said that statements about Russian aggression were being used as a pretext to station more NATO military equipment near the Russian borders. Politicians from several Western countries accuse Russia of organizing the migration crisis on the Belarusian-Polish border and thus making common cause with the Belarusian president Alexander Lukashenko. Ukraine is the largest country in Europe after Russia. Since the declaration of independence in December 1991, the presidential republic has faced the greatest challenges in its recent history. Developments in Ukraine are of deep international concern and have led to a low point in Russian-Western relations. First, the protests on Maidan Square in 2013, then the removal of the government, and finally the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia. For years, civil war-like conditions prevailed in the east of the country between separatists loyal to Moscow and pro-European forces. There is no end in sight to the conflict. The disputes flare up again and again, as recently in March 21. At the end of November 2013, there were mass protests in the Eastern European country. The Ukrainian government stopped a planned association agreement with the EU on November 21, 2013, thus plunging the country into a deep crisis. The west of the country wants Ukraine to be more closely linked to Europe, but President Viktor Yanukovych has sought rapprochement with Russia at that time. This decision was followed by months of protests against the leadership of President Yanukovych and Prime Minister Mykola Azarov in Maidan Square in Kiev. The protests spread across the country. People called for the reintroduction of the 2004 constitution, early parliamentary and presidential elections, an independent judiciary, and the fight against corruption. President Yanukovych finally declared himself ready for new elections. Nevertheless, the parliament relieved Yanukovych of his office and set up a transitional government. That was only when the real problems began. A new conflict was igniting in eastern Ukraine and especially on the Crimean Peninsula. Sevastopol in Crimea is the home port of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Russian-speaking units, Moscow spoke of local self-defense forces, without a sovereign badge gradually controlled the entire peninsula, but above all, the military facilities. Russian warships had left the Mediterranean and strengthened the fleet in the Black Sea. In doing so, Russia violated the stationing agreement on the Black Sea Fleet, which provides for a maximum number of soldiers and material, as well as restricted freedom of movement. On March 16th in 2014, the majority of Russian-speaking citizens of Crimea decided in a controversial referendum to join Russia. Kremlin boss Vladimir Putin immediately nailed his head and it's German wording. He created the legal prerequisites for admitting the peninsula to the Russian Federation. With that, part of Ukraine was split off. The West condemned Russia's annexation of Crimea as contrary to international law. Since then, there have been violent riots in eastern Ukraine between the Western-oriented and the pro-Russian parts of the population. Pro-Russian separatists and Ukrainian military fight each other. The sources of fire are the cities of Lugansk, Odessa, Kharkov, Slavyansk, and Donbas. Another high-reaching point in the development of secession in the country was on May 11th in 2014. Pro-Russian separatists initiated a referendum in Donetsk and Lugansk for secession from Ukraine. Diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis have been in full swing ever since. So far, however, all talks between the EU representatives and President Putin have not yielded any results. Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, and their observers were posted to Ukraine. With the presidential election on May 25th in 2014 and its clear winner Petro Poroshenko, the Ukrainians and the international community hoped for relaxation. But this hope was deceptive. After Malaysia Airlines shot down got a passenger plane shot down, flight MH17, while 298 people were killed in 2014, the Ukraine crisis has reached a new dimension and triggered worldwide horror. 2 years later, an international investigation team blames Russia for the disaster. A Russian Buk missile from a rebel-held village should have shot down the machine. The Kremlin, on the other hand, accuses Ukraine, and according to the Russian radar data, the plane was not shot at from the territory of the pro-Russian separatists. International investigators assigned the weapon to Russian military brigade 4 years after flight MH17 was shot down over eastern Ukraine. The investigation commission, headed by the Netherlands, concluded that the missile of the anti-aircraft system of the Buk type came from the 53rd Anti-Aircraft Brigade in Kursk in Russia. The team of investigators was able to reconstruct the route of the rocket from Kursk to the Ukrainian border. Numerous photos, videos and testimonies would prove that. Russia has so far rejected all allegations and blames Ukraine. No air defense system has ever crossed the Ukrainian border, they say. In the parliamentary elections in October 2014, the pro-European parties achieved an overwhelming victory. However, the pro-Russian separatists seeking independence from Ukraine rejected the election. As a result, on November 2nd in 2014, they held their own general election and parliamentary elections in the so-called People's Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. As expected, the rebel leaders Igor Plotnitsky in Lugansk and Alexander Zakharenko in Donetsk were declared the winners of the East Ukraine election. Only pro-Russian opponents stood for election. The majority of the movements led by Plotnitsky and Zakharchenko moved into the People's Councils. Opposition parties did not take part. In the hope of bringing peace to the situation, a so-called Minsk agreement was negotiated by Kiev and the pro-Russian separatists in autumn 2014, which provided for a ceasefire. The situation came to a head again in January 2015. Ukrainian government troops launched a major attack on the embattled airport in the city of Donetsk, and the separatists launched an offensive that was set up in February 2015. No sustainable ceasefire could be achieved in Donbas. Many questions in the Ukraine conflict have remained unanswered since then. The current ceasefire has repeatedly been violated by both sides over the past few years, even if the fighting abated at times. According to UN figures, more than 13,000 people have died on the part of the Ukrainian troops and pro-Russian separatists so far. According to the United Nations Refugee Agency, over 800,000 people are on the run. Much of the infrastructure around Donetsk, Lugansk and Gorlovka was destroyed, and electricity and drinking water are only available to a very limited extent. In March 2021, the clashes in Donbas flared up again. In view of the renewed escalation of the situation, Russia has pulled together a large number of troops on the border with Ukraine and on the annexed Crimean Peninsula. If the fighting continued to rise, Russia has threatened military intervention to protect its citizens. In the hope of bringing peace to the situation, as I said, there was a Minsk agreement negotiated by Kiev and the pro-Russian separatists in autumn 2014. But representatives of the separatists, the Russian government, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, wanted to negotiate further steps towards peace with the representatives of Kiev in Minsk. Since the Minsk agreements were not implemented, the conflicting parties agreed on a renewed ceasefire in Donbas in February 2015 and negotiated the Minsk II agreement, also just known as the Minsk Agreement, at a meeting in Minsk. It builds on the first Minsk agreements from September 2014. The agreement was reached by Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President François Hollande, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, and Russian President Vladimir Putin. Minsk II is a 13-point agreement that should end the fierce fighting in eastern Ukraine through political processes and ensure peace in the long term. Among other things, the heavy weapons should be withdrawn and a demilitarized buffer zone set up. In the years that followed, however, there were repeated violations of the ceasefire, and the provisions of the agreement were only partially implemented. With the new Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, who took office in 2019, new hopes arose that something could change again in the deadlocked Minsk peace process. Zelensky declared immediately after his election victory, "We will continue the Minsk process and restart it, and do everything possible to ensure that the ceasefire is observed." However, these hopes for peace are now clouded again by the flare-up of the clashes in Donbas in March 2021 and the gathering of troops along the border. Russia's behavior should not be without consequences. There were several indications that Russia was infiltrating soldiers and weapons without sovereign badges into Ukraine and controlling the struggles of the separatists. According to eyewitness reports, the elections were also said to have been guarded by Russian forces and the results to have been falsified. The European Union and the United States of America imposed sanctions in the form of entry bans and account freezes on Russian and Ukrainian politicians. Further economic restrictions for Russia in the banking sector followed. In response to Western economic sanctions, Russia stopped imports of agricultural products from the EU and the US. Due to the ongoing disputes, the sanctions were finally extended until 2021, and we will see how that will continue, because the whole trouble in the Ukraine is not ended, and in this case, Boris Johnson is doing something right in having an eye on that. I'll see you in my next video. Bis gleich.